Good morning and happy Valentine's Day. When I was in about second grade, I guess about 8 years old, I started getting really interested in music. And the British invasion happened, and there was all this amazing rock and roll coming out. About the time I was starting to form my views of the world, as a child and adolescent. And as I'm sure you're aware, variations on love, falling in love, being in love, falling out of love, losing love, all those things were by far the most common topics for pop songs back then. And I presume it's probably, I don't listen to a whole lot of contemporary pop music, but I assume it's probably still the case. So as I was starting to experience relationships, falling in love, falling out of love, losing love, all that stuff, I was expecting romance to resemble these songs that I liked. And I guess for some people, movies and television, romantic comedies, and that kind of thing, provide models for relationships, for what relationships should be like. But over time, I started to realize that pop songs and sitcoms are not really good models for healthy relationships. So I don't claim by any means to have figured out the key to romance. But I've learned a few things along the way. And so I thought I'd talk about that a little bit today, this being St. Valentine's Day. And by the way, if you ever try to research the history of Valentine's Day, there's an awful lot that's very vague and that we don't really know. But in our culture, one way or another, this day has become associated with romance and love. And so I think it would not be a bad idea to kind of consider this as a time to approach love as a way to practice mindfulness. When he left the palace and his wife and child to go in search for a path of freedom from suffering, the Buddha became celibate. And he remained that way for the rest of his life, even after his enlightenment and after he went home to visit his family. But that doesn't mean that he didn't value relationships between wife and husband, or between wife and child, things like that. In fact, it was partly out of love for his family that Gautama became the Buddha. He realized that despite all the privileges that he could offer his wife and child, they were going to ultimately experience suffering. And so he went in search of a path of liberation, partly to help spare them. His wife actually eventually ordained and became fully enlightened. So I can't imagine a better way to express your care for someone than to give them complete, total, and eternal spiritual freedom. But that's a little different than what we usually think about when we think about loving somebody. But love takes a lot of different forms, whether we talk about loving our spouse or our child or a good friend, or whether we talk about loving our neighbor the way the Bible says we should, or love for all of our fellow beings. But I think that there are things that all loving relationships have in common, and that we can keep these things in mind when we're trying to develop the skills to do what we might call loving mindfully. Rita read a few minutes ago from his book, How to Love, where Thich Nhat Hanh talks about what he calls the 4 elements of true love. And that phrase, true love, is an interesting one. And I think you could probably argue that there are a lot of different ways to love truly and authentically. But I think that these 4 elements of love that Thich Nhat Hanh mentioned, and which the Buddha called the Brahma Viharas, are really essential ingredients to any loving relationship. Brahma Viharas, by the way, means divine abodes. And in ancient India, these were considered the highest, most sacred states of mind. Brahma was the highest form of deity, and Vihara means dwelling place. So this is kind of the place where the most sacred state of mind resides. They're often referred to as the boundless states because we try to develop these states in meditation like we did a little bit earlier, in a way that we can extend them to all beings throughout all realms of space and time. So a number of you have worked with these things in meditation, I know, and these are good ways to cultivate your mind, but they're also provide a good framework for relating day to day with the people that we encounter. And I think it's helpful to check our feelings for our loved ones to see if these states of mind are present in our relationship with them. So a lot of the time when we say we love someone, what we really mean is that we want to attach to them in some way, or that we're attracted to them and we want them to attach to us. And there's not really anything wrong with that, that provided that we're reasonably healthy people and that we're talking about reasonably healthy and sane forms of attachment. I mean, that's pretty much how the human species has managed to survive this long. But there's a Pali word, metta, and I think in his book, Thich Nhat Hanh uses the Sanskrit form, maitri. And this word is often translated as love or loving kindness, which I think is what Thich Nhat Hanh used. But this is a different kind of love than what we're usually talking about. And I actually prefer to use the term goodwill rather than love, because it doesn't involve attaching to someone. Metta really means wanting someone to be happy. And I think the wish for a loved one to be happy is a critical factor in the act of true loving authentically. The thought, I want you to be happy, is very different from the thought, I need you for my happiness. And that's often what people mean when they say love. But we can want happiness for another person and at the same time enjoy the way we feel when we're with them and want to keep that form of happiness available to us and maintain that relationship. But before we can truly have metta or goodwill for another, we have to have it for ourselves. If you don't develop the resources for your own happiness, it's very difficult to develop meaningfully the resources to help someone else be happy. You may very sincerely want them to be happy, but you're also likely to confuse loving them with needing to feel loved by them. So your love could easily digress into feelings of dependency or need to control things or control them or the relationship. So part of loving mindfully involves making sure that we're caring for our own inner life first. The Buddha was once talking to a group of monks about an acrobat that he had seen training a new assistant. And this particular type of acrobat would do this act where he would climb to the top of a tall bamboo pole and he would balance up there at the tip of this pole. And he would do some tricks while he was up there. So he climbed up and then he called down to this assistant, this young woman that he was training, and said, "Come, climb up the pole and stand on my shoulders." And so the assistant did as instructed. And the acrobat called up to her and said, "Now you look after me and I'll look after you." And so with us looking after one another, guarding one another, we'll do our act and then we can safely climb down our pole and make some money. Well, the assistant thought about this for a minute. She decided she didn't like that idea. She said, "That won't do at all, master. You look after yourself and I'll look after myself. With each of us looking after ourselves, guarding ourselves, we can do our act and then safely climb down and make some money. That's the right way to do this." Well, the Buddha said, well, just as the assistant said to her master, "I will look after myself," so should you practice the establishment of mindfulness. But you should also practice the establishment of mindfulness by saying, "I will look after others." Looking after yourself, one looks after others. Looking after others, one looks after oneself. You look after others by looking after yourself through practicing mindfulness, developing mindfulness, always being mindful. You look after yourself by looking after others through patience, through non-harming, metta, and compassion. So I think the Buddha's instructions here are kind of a nice way to think about the idea of true love. On the one hand, you watch after yourself, safeguarding your inner peace, taking responsibility for your own feelings and your own happiness. But on the other hand, you do what you can to look after your loved ones by being patient and understanding, honoring your commitments and being kind, and thus you help safeguard the other person's happiness also. And these two things are very interdependent. You think of looking after yourself and looking after others as being separate things, but really you can't fully do one without doing the other. So your mindfulness of your own peace and your mindfulness of your relationships with others are really, unless you happen to live in a cave, pretty closely related. So the next ingredient in our recipe for true love is compassion, which is the desire to help your loved ones to not suffer. looking after the other. To do this involves developing the capacity to understand your own suffering first, and then recognize it when you see it in others. So you could probably say that every relationship of any significance that lasts for any time at all is going to eventually involve some form of conflict. And without compassion, conflict can easily generate anger, anxiety, other potentially destructive states of mind. To be compassionate begins with becoming understanding, being able to recognize the stress and suffering that the loved one is experiencing. And often this means being able to see ourselves in the role we play in creating stress. When I was working on my certification in Japanese psychology, I talked Michelle into, there was a course that the Toto Institute was offering about working with your relationships. And you had to be in a relationship and have your partner participate in it with you. So I talked Michelle into doing it, even though she was buried under work with grad school at the time, but she agreed to do it. And so it was led by Linda Anderson Creech. And Linda gave us a really interesting assignment at one point called Through Your Partner's Eyes. And I'll read you what she asked us to do. And take a period of quiet reflection to look through your partner's eyes. What does your partner have to put up with? What challenging habits and tendencies do you have that your partner has to deal with? Look broadly and deeply at the impact you have. The challenge of understanding those we love is to see things through their eyes and step into their shoes. This is not easy, but doing so can uproot our self-righteous inclinations and tone down our judgments and criticisms. And so we were supposed to each spend 30 minutes reflecting on the challenges, difficulties, and inconveniences that we saw when we looked at ourselves through our partner's eyes. And doing something like that is a really nice way to kind of develop compassion for your partner, along with developing a sort of closer awareness of your own actions and how they impact your relationship. Thich Nhat Hanh suggests another practice that he calls the 4 mantras of love. You know, a mantra is a word or a phrase that you can say or just use silently that contains some spiritual power. So if you're building a relationship or looking for a way to transform or strengthen a relationship, you might try these mantras. They're pretty helpful. They're built around the idea of understanding and compassion for yourself and for your loved one. So the first mantra really is meant to just kind of help you be present. You can't love if you're not there, even if you're physically there but mentally somewhere else. So to do this one, you call to mind your loved one if they're not around, or you face them. If they are, you look at them. And then you say silently in your own heart, I am here for you. I am here for you. So to be present like that is one step in creating a stronger relationship. The next step is to recognize the presence and the importance of the other person. You can't care about someone if you don't know who they are. So to practice the second mantra, you do the same thing. You look at them or you hold them in your mind's eye, and you repeat silently to yourself the phrase, I know you are there, and I'm glad. I know you're there, and I'm glad. Partners can often be difficult. Relationships have conflict. And it's important to recognize that their difficulty, angry words, thoughtless remarks, and things like that, are really the expressions of suffering, the way suffering expresses itself. So, in a way, the pain that you're feeling and the pain that's coming toward you is kind of their suffering, leaving their heart and coming into our own. So we can be better prepared to deal with it if we understand what's going on. So the third mantra shifts us from focusing our reaction to focusing on what's really happening. I know you're suffering, and I'm here for you. I know you're suffering, and I'm here for you. Our own suffering can take similar forms. Our stress can be a source of adversity for our partner. And so we need to be aware of that and to shift our focus away from external blaming and so on to understanding what our own heart is sending out. And so for this we have the fourth mantra. I am suffering, please help me. I'm suffering, please help me. I read something once from a biologist who said that if you place two living heart cells from different people into a petri dish, that they're eventually going to start communicating with one another, and they'll find a third beat, and they'll start beating together. The philosopher Mark Nepoke said he thinks that this little biological fact proves that regardless of any resistance that we feel, or any of our own shortcomings, that life itself holds what he calls an essential joining force. He says the inborn ability to find and enliven a common beat is the miracle of love. This force is what makes compassion possible, even probable. If two cells can find a common pulse beneath everything, how much more can full hearts feel when all excuses fall away? So when two hearts beat together this way, that's an expression of understanding and of compassion, but it's also kind of a joyful experience. And this brings us to the third of the Brahma Viharas, the third factor in true love, which is sharing the joy of life. This is related to gratitude. Something good happens to you, you enjoy that. If you think about it as a gift you receive, you feel grateful. Your loved one is a gift, and your loved one also gives a lot. So partly we acknowledge joy and gratitude for the gifts that we receive, but we should also be joyful when we give something to our partner. And we can be grateful for the other gifts that our partner receives. It takes a few minutes to think about that. Does your loved one have good health? You can be happy for that. Did he or she get a promotion or have some other good fortune? Share in their enjoyment of that good fortune. This is a good antidote to resentment, to recognize that someone else's good fortune is also your own good fortune, and be happy for it. But also just to take the time to be grateful and appreciate what you and your loved one share. That's a really good way to brighten your state of mind, create a shared sense of happiness, get your hearts to beat together. So even though we share our loved one's life, we share in their good fortune, we wish them happiness, we want to spare them from suffering, we also have to accept that we're each responsible for our own lives. And so this is the fourth factor in true love, equanimity. This means that whatever happens, we can keep our own minds in balance. Equanimity requires us to work on acceptance, both of ourselves and of our loved one. So the first thing to do is to accept our own feelings and our own failings as well. Doesn't mean that we don't work to change bad habits, because we should. Doesn't mean that we don't work to react to things more skillfully, which we should. It means that when we get angry or when we get overly worried or whatever, we accept our feelings as natural, and then we look for ways to respond appropriately to whatever needs to be done. And second, we accept that our loved ones are trying to be happy, trying to avoid discomfort, trying to fulfill their own purpose in life. So like those acrobats balancing atop a long bamboo pole, we need to give them the freedom to look after themselves, even as we look after them. We don't have to feel good about what needs doing. We can get angry and still make sure that our actions of body and speech are not harmful. We can feel insecure and still be patient. Give our loved one freedom to grow and change in ways that will help them to fulfill their own purpose. So if you practice mindfulness like this in your relationships, you're able to appreciate the beauty available in the present moment. And then keep in mind what the Buddha said. Looking after oneself, one looks after others. Looking after others, one looks after oneself. Look after yourself through practicing mindfulness. Look after others through patience, non-harming, goodwill, and compassion. So now and then, maybe on Valentine's Day or whenever you think about it, just take a time to sit for a moment and really appreciate what it means to have someone to love. Thank you for your attention.